In 1996, 6 black kids disappeared after going trick-or-treating together. 20 years later, a neighbor remodeling their garage finds a large, chained freezer buried under the floor. That Halloween night in 1996 had started like any other in the small, tight-knit community of Oakhaven. Crisp autumn air, the smell of burning leaves, and the excited chatter of children dressed as superheroes, witches, and ghosts. 6 of them, all from neighboring houses on Willow Creek Drive, had gathered under the dim glow of Mrs. Franklin's porch light. Marcus, the oldest at 12, felt very responsible for his little brother Darius, who was 8 and dressed as a bright red Power Ranger. Jamal, 10, was Marcus's best friend, his laughter echoing as he showed off his vampire fangs. Keisha, 9, a princess with a glittering tiara, clutched her plastic pumpkin, telling everyone, "I'm going to get the most candy this year." And then there were the twins, Maya and Mia, just 7, holding hands, 2 identical little black cats, their painted whiskers already smudging from early candy consumption. Their mothers had watched them go, a chorus of "Stay together" and "Be back by 9" following them down the sidewalk. It was a street where everyone knew everyone. What could go wrong? They never came back. 9 o'clock came and went. Then 10. Panic. A cold serpent began to uncoil in the warm living rooms. Calls were made. Doors were knocked on. Soon, flashlights cut through the darkness, neighbors fanning out, their voices hoarse from shouting names into the uncaring night. "Marcus! Keisha! Where are you?" The police arrived, their flashing lights painting streaks of red and blue on worried faces. They asked questions. Had the kids mentioned going anywhere specific? Were there any strangers seen in the area? No, nothing out of the ordinary. Just Halloween. But how could 6 children simply vanish from familiar streets? The days that followed were a blur of yellow tape, grim-faced officers, and the unending hollow ache of absence. Search parties combed through the nearby woods, their calls swallowed by the trees. Divers checked the murky waters of Miller's Pond. Nothing. Not a shoe, not a dropped piece of candy, not a single thread from their costumes. It was as if the night itself had swallowed them whole. The local news buzzed for a week, then 2. Then the story moved to the back pages, replaced by newer tragedies, fresher headlines. But for the families on Willow Creek Drive, the headlines never faded. Their lives became a permanent, silent scream. Sarah, Marcus, and Darius's mother kept their bedroom door closed, unable to face the small beds, the neatly arranged toys. She'd stand outside it sometimes, just listening, as if she could still hear their playful arguments. What if she'd kept them home that night? The question haunted her sleep, her waking hours. Keisha's mother, Maria, found a half-finished drawing on her daughter's desk, a princess, just like her costume. She framed it, a vibrant splash of color in a world that had turned gray. The parents of the twins, they clung to each other, the silence in their house doubly profound. How do you mourn 2 at once? The investigation sputtered, then died. There were no credible leads, no ransom notes, no witnesses to anything beyond the kids walking down Sycamore Lane, their bags already heavy with treats, their faces bright with joy. They were last seen near the corner, just a few houses down from where the old Henderson place stood, a house that had always been a little rundown, even back then. Old man Henderson had been a recluse, rarely seen. He'd passed away a few years after the disappearances. The house sold quietly. Did anyone even think to look there, really look? The police said they'd checked everywhere. But did they? The files grew dusty. The children became fading photographs on a notice board, their smiles frozen in time. Hope, a fragile thing, withered with each passing year, replaced by a dull, persistent grief. For 20 years, That grief was the only thing that remained. 20 Halloweens came and went, each one a fresh stab of pain. Then, in the summer of 2016, David Carter bought the old Henderson place on Sycamore Lane. It was a fixer-upper, the price reflecting its neglect. David was young, energetic, and saw potential in the crumbling structure. He planned to start with the detached garage. It was practically falling down. He'd lived in Oakhaven for only a year, knew vaguely about the old tragedy, the missing kids, but it felt like a story from another time, distant and sorrowful, but not his. Until that Saturday morning, the air in the garage was thick with the smell of dust, damp earth, and something else, something faintly metallic, unsettling. He'd been jackhammering the old concrete floor, planning to pour a new one. The machine shuddered, then hit something solid, something that wasn't supposed to be there. What now, he thought, annoyed. He cleared away the debris, his curiosity growing. It was metal, smooth and cold under his work gloves. He dug around the edges, his breath catching in his throat. It was big, too big. He worked for an hour, sweat stinging his eyes, a strange foreboding settling over him. The shape that emerged was unmistakably a freezer. A large, old-fashioned chest freezer, the kind his grandmother used to have. White, or what was once white, now stained yellow and brown with age and dirt. But it wasn't just the freezer. It was the chains. Heavy, rusted chains were wrapped around it, secured with a thick, formidable padlock. Why would anyone bury a freezer and chain it shut like that? A shiver, cold and sharp, ran down David's spine despite the summer heat. This wasn't right. This felt wrong, deeply wrong. His mind, slow at first, then racing, started to connect dots he hadn't even known existed. The old stories, the missing children, this house, this very street. Could it be? No, it couldn't. 20 years. But the chains, the buried secret. His heart hammered against his ribs. He backed away from the unearthed tomb, his hands trembling. He pulled out his phone, his fingers fumbling with the screen. Who do you even call for something like this? He dialed 911, his voice barely a whisper when the operator answered. He said, "You need to come to Sycamore Lane. I think I found something. Something terrible." He didn't know then just how terrible it would be. He didn't know he had just cracked open a nightmare that had been sleeping for 2 decades. The ground beneath Oakhaven, it seemed, held more than just pipes and roots. It held secrets. And this one was about to scream. The wait for the police felt like an eternity. David sat on an overturned bucket outside the garage, staring at the partially exposed freezer. The sun beat down, but he felt cold. What was inside? He tried not to think about it, but the images came anyway. Dark and horrifying, fueled by hushed town whispers he'd dismissed as folklore. 6 children. 6 smiling faces on faded posters he'd seen once at the old library. Could they really have been this close all along? Buried under someone's floor? The thought was monstrous. He heard sirens in the distance, growing louder, and a strange mix of dread and relief washed over him. Whatever was in there, it wouldn't be his secret alone for much longer. The quiet street, Willow Creek Drive, just one over, was about to wake up from its long, uneasy slumber. The families of Marcus, Jamal, Keisha, Maya, Mia, and Darius, they were about to have their world shattered all over again. But this time, would there be answers, or just more pain? The first police car pulled up, and David stood, pointing towards the garage, unable to speak. The officer's eyes followed his finger, and his easygoing expression vanished. This was no ordinary call. The police tape went up, a stark yellow gash across the familiar green of David Carter's newly acquired lawn. It felt like 1996 all over again, but the hope that had flickered then, however faint, was now replaced by a certainty that something awful lay just beneath the surface. The neighborhood buzzed, windows twitching with curtains pulled aside by unseen hands. Whispers traveled faster than the officers walking the perimeter. A freezer? Chained? Here? The questions hung in the humid summer air, heavy and unspoken among the older residents. They remembered the Hendersons, quiet folk, kept to themselves. Could they have? No. The mind recoiled from the implication, but the freezer sat there, a silent, cold accusation. The initial responding officers knew this was too big for them. They called in detectives. They called in the forensic team. This wasn't just a strange discovery. This was a potential tomb. Detective Alicia Washington arrived on the scene. She was young, compared to the case, having been just a child herself in 1996. But she knew the legend of the Oakhaven Six. It was a local horror story, a cautionary tale whispered among kids for years. Now, it was her case, her responsibility. She looked at the house, unremarkable and drab. She looked at David Carter, pale and shaken. Then she looked at the garage, and the glint of metal and chain in the disturbed earth. Her stomach tightened. 20 years. 20 years of silence. 20 years of families living in a hell of not knowing. Was this it? Was this where the silence would finally break? She took a deep breath. She had to be methodical. She had to be prepared for whatever lay inside that rusted chest. But a part of her, the human part, the part that remembered being a child, felt a profound sense of dread. What horrors had this quiet street concealed for so long? The sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows. The chains on the freezer seemed to gleam in the fading light, holding their secrets tight. The team was preparing to cut them. The air was thick with anticipation, and a fear so old it felt almost sacred. What was inside that box, buried for 2 decades? The answer, everyone knew, would change everything. The arrival of the news vans was inevitable. Their lights added to the chaotic strobing of the police vehicles, turning the quiet suburban street into a media circus. Neighbors gathered at the edge of the police tape, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and genuine fear. Some were old enough to remember the faces of the missing children, the desperate pleas of their parents. For them, this wasn't just a news story. It was a wound being ripped open. Sarah, Marcus, and Darius's mother heard about it from a frantic call. A freezer? At the old Henderson place? She felt the blood drain from her face. No, it couldn't be. After all this time, her husband had passed away 5 years ago, his heart finally giving out under the strain of a grief that never lessened. She was alone with it now, this new, terrible possibility. She wanted to run to Sycamore Lane, to see for herself, but her legs wouldn't move. She just sank into a chair, the phone slipping from her numb fingers. 20 years of prayers, 20 years of hoping for a miracle, even a terrible one, just to know. Was this the answer to those prayers? A chained freezer buried in the dirt? The thought was a fresh wave of agony. What would they find? The question echoed in the silent house, a chilling prelude to a truth she wasn't sure she could bear. The night was falling, and with it, a darkness deeper than any Oakhaven had known before. The forensic team, clad in white suits, moved with grim precision. The sound of the bolt cutters slicing through the rusted chains was sharp, metallic, unnaturally loud in the tense silence. Snap, snap. Each cut seemed to echo the breaking of a 20-year seal. The main padlock, corroded and stubborn, resisted. They had to use a grinder, sparks flying in the dim light of the garage, the acrid smell of burning metal filling the air. David Carter watched from a distance, feeling like an intruder on a scene of profound sorrow. He wished he'd never started renovating that damn garage. But then, if he hadn't, what then? Would this secret have stayed buried forever? Detective Washington stood close, her face impassive, but her eyes betraying the tension. She'd notified the families, a call she would never forget. The raw pain on the other end of the line, the choked sobs, the whispered questions. Is it them? Do you think it's them? She couldn't give them answers, not yet. But the weight of their grief, their desperate need to know, pressed down on her. The last chain fell away. The lid of the freezer was now unsecured. A collective breath was held. What secrets had it guarded for 2 long decades? The moment had arrived. One of the forensic officers, gloved hands steady, reached for the lid. He hesitated for just a second, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes behind the protective goggles. Then he lifted it. A rush of cold, stale air escaped, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible odor. Not decay, not yet. Something else. Something sweetly chemical? Detective Washington leaned closer, her flashlight beam cutting into the darkness of the freezer's interior. At first, it was just a jumble. Colors, plastics, things that didn't belong in a freezer. Not like this. Her light settled on a familiar shape, a grotesque, grinning caricature. A cheap plastic Halloween mask, the kind that cost $1 or $2 at the local store back in the 90s. Then another, and another. A vampire, a princess, with a broken plastic jewel. A Power Ranger, its red faded to a dull pink. Candy wrappers, dozens of them, their bright logos still visible. Chocolate bars, lollipops, chewing gum, the brands popular 2 decades ago. Her blood ran cold. These weren't just random items. This was Halloween, 1996. Her gaze swept the contents again, a growing horror dawning in her eyes. This was exactly what they had feared, but mixed in with the masks and the wrappers, nestled deeper, almost hidden, was something else. Something that didn't glitter. Something that wasn't a toy. Something that made the air in the garage feel suddenly colder, heavier, and infinitely more menacing. It was still wrapped, but its outline was chillingly familiar. What was it? And what did it mean for the fate of 6 innocent children? The silence stretched, broken only by the click of a camera. The first part of the nightmare was over. The next was just beginning. The preliminary inventory of the freezer's contents sent a fresh wave of sickness through Detective Washington. Halloween masks, yes. 6 of them. Each one a poignant reminder of a child's last happy moments. Candy wrappers, too numerous to count, a ghostly feast. But beneath them, carefully placed, were 6 small, tattered trick-or-treat bags. Plastic pumpkins, a fabric sack with a ghost printed on it. Each one contained not candy, but a small, neatly folded set of clothes. The costumes the children had been wearing. The Power Ranger suit, the princess dress, the cat ears, the vampire cape, all there, as if they'd been carefully removed and preserved. Why? Why keep these? It was a chilling question. And there was more. At the very bottom, beneath the folded clothes, lay the item that had made the forensic officer pause. It was a roll of heavy-duty duct tape, almost new. Next to it, a length of rope, cut cleanly at both ends. And a small child-sized sneaker, a popular brand from the mid-90s, caked in dried mud that didn't match the soil in David Carter's garage. Whose shoe was it? And where was its owner? The implications were horrifying. This wasn't just a dumping ground. This was something else. Something calculated. The freezer hadn't just been buried, it had been a prison, or perhaps a coffin. But for what, or for whom, exactly? The items posed more questions than answers. painting a grim, incomplete picture. The children hadn't just vanished. They had been taken. They had been controlled. And someone had gone to great lengths to preserve these tokens. But why these specific tokens? Was it a trophy? A reminder? Or was there an even darker purpose? The team bagged every item with meticulous care. Each candy wrapper, each thread from a costume, was now a precious clue in a case that had just exploded back to life. 20 years of cold silence had just been shattered by the opening of a rusted lid, and the truth, Washington suspected, was going to be far worse than anyone had ever imagined. The neighborhood outside was still buzzing, but inside the garage, a somber quiet had fallen. The weight of what they'd found, and what it meant, was suffocating. The journey to find answers had just taken a very dark turn, into a past someone had tried very hard to keep buried. The families were notified of the initial findings, the masks, the costumes. Each piece of information was a fresh torment. Sarah, mother of Marcus and Darius, heard about the Power Ranger costume and the vampire cape, and a sound escaped her, a raw, animalistic cry of pain that came from a place deeper than 20 years of grief had managed to reach. It was them. It had to be them. But where were they? Were they in there? The detective on the phone was cautious, gentle. No human remains had been found. Not yet. The freezer was being transported to the county morgue for a more thorough examination in a controlled environment. But the absence of bodies in the freezer didn't bring relief. It only deepened the mystery, thickened the dread. If not in the freezer, then where? What had happened after the costumes were removed? The duct tape, the rope, the detective didn't mention those to the families. Not yet. There was no need to add that particular horror to their already unbearable burden. Not until they knew more. But Detective Washington knew. She knew those items signified a level of terror and control that made her feel sick. This wasn't a quick, impulsive act. This was planned. This was methodical. This was monstrous. The old Henderson house, now David Carter's property, became the epicenter of an intense investigation. Who were the Hendersons really? Mr. Henderson, the supposed recluse, had died in 2002, 6 years after the children vanished. His wife had predeceased him by several years. He had no living relatives that anyone could easily trace. He'd lived a quiet, unremarkable life, as far as anyone in Oakhaven knew. He was elderly, frail, people said. Could he have overpowered 6 children? Could he have dug that hole, moved that heavy freezer? It seemed unlikely. But then, what was the alternative? Had someone else used his property? Someone with access? The questions multiplied. The previous owner. That was the first, most obvious lead. But as the night wore on, and the contents of the freezer were catalogued under the sterile lights of the lab, a new, even more disturbing question began to form in Washington's mind. The items were too specific, too curated. It felt personal. Was this about more than just making them disappear? The sneaker, caked in that strange mud. Where had it come from? That mud could be a key. If they could trace its origin, it might lead them somewhere. Somewhere the children had been. Somewhere the truth lay buried, perhaps even deeper than the freezer. The night was far from over. For the families, it was the beginning of a new vigil. For Detective Washington, it was the start of a hunt. A hunt for a ghost, a monster who had walked among them, hidden in plain sight, for 2 long decades. And she had a terrible feeling that the most disturbing discoveries were still to come. What else was hidden, not just in the freezer, but in the past? Have you ever heard of anything like this? Share your thoughts or stories in the comments.